Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here officially now for day number 1 of the 2023 World Championships. Obviously, we already had the World's Qualifying Series yesterday, but that's not technically a part of the World Championships. That's to qualify, appropriately, for the World Championships. So we're finally here, day 1 of play-ins. We have finally done it. The entire year in League of Legends has led up to this, and I'm incredibly excited to go over some of these games. If you are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, we're going to be going over the 2 series that we got on day number 1 here today, but quickly, at the beginning of this video, if you do enjoy what you see, basically at any point throughout this video, or if you've enjoyed a lot of my content up until this point, hit the subscribe button. It really does mean a lot. We're really trying to grow. We're really close to 1.5K, and I would really appreciate it if you guys kind of push that over the top, kind of got us there. That would be really appreciated, especially during World Season. Of course, if you do enjoy the video at any point, leave a like. It really does mean a lot, but I don't want to just advertise your ear off. You're here for a video, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. What we're going to be doing in this video, if you are new to the channel, is going game by game in both of the series that happened today in the play-ins, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in each series, and then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. But without further ado, let's jump into our first one here. Of course, we're starting off with the A side of the bracket. You know, bracket A, I think is what it's technically called. Both of the first round series in that side of the bracket here today, and that means we get to kick it off with a matchup between the number 1 seed from the PCS in PSG Talon and the number 1 seed from the LLA in Movistar R7. Very intriguing matchup on paper. First and foremost, when it comes to Bracket A, I talked about this a lot in my play-in video, or my primer video, I should say, where we went over all the teams. Little bit of a plug. If you haven't checked out that video, I highly recommend you go and check that out before watching this one. We go into all 23 teams in that almost 3-hour-long video, going in-depth on what you can expect them to show, you know, in terms of their playstyle and the players that you should be watching for them, including all 4 of the teams we're going to cover here today. But if you notice in my primer video, and also something that I talked about in my World's Qualifying Series video yesterday, this side of the bracket is so much stronger than the other side. I think you could argue that all 4 of the teams on this side of the bracket are better than the 3 worst teams on the other side of the bracket, which is certainly something I said in my primer video. I think this is an interesting matchup. I do think this is probably the predictable best team in the group versus the predictable worst team in the group, but even the difference between these 2 teams really isn't that large in my head. PSG should be favorites going into this series. They're the only team in play-ins outside of BDS now that I had in my C tier of teams at Worlds. Everybody else was in the D tier. I think PSG is for real. I think they're not exactly the most exciting team in the entire world. They are one of the slowest teams at this tournament, which is probably going to put some people off, but they're very consistent, and I think they are going to consistently be able to beat teams that they are just better than. Movistar should be one of them, but R7 is kind of much better than you would expect. You would expect a team from the LLA to not really be all that competitive. It's a region that really hasn't been all that good on the international stage ever, really, but R7 just had their best performance internationally at MSI, actually winning a best-of-3 series, which was obviously fantastic. I think that they came back in summer and were just as good, if not better, around the board, and I like this R7 team. I think in a lot of circumstances, I would be hyping them up. It's just unfortunate that they're going against PSG in the first round here, because I think PSG is clearly the best team on this side of the bracket, and they should be favorites going into this series. But again, R7 is not a pushover by any means. If PSG, for example, goes into this series just unprepared and not ready for them, they're a team that can surprise. They're certainly talented enough, and so prediction is definitely PSG, but R7 is certainly a team that can make some interesting things happen. Are they going to be able to do that? Well, of course, we're going to find out starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was PSG. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0. And they're going to do it in relatively predictable fashion. This was not a game where you can say, oh, you know, PSG showed us something new. This is exactly what we thought we were going to get out of PSG at this tournament. A bit of early aggression coming in from R7 that did catch PSG at the very least a little bit off guard, but at the end of the day, they are just so much better towards the back half of the game and so much more reliable than anybody else that they're probably going to go up against at this level that they are just going to be able to pull out a lot of wins purely from knowing what to do in the mid to late game, being incredibly consistent there, and, you know, having a lot of confidence in their ability to play out that part of the game. And so, credit to PSG, they went for a more death ball kind of comp here. And while generally I don't necessarily believe that that's the strongest comp in the game right now, I think this particular draft is actually incredibly smart. Coming in from PSG, they basically have 3 winning lanes when you look across the board, or at least in terms of tempo. They should have 3 winning lanes. The Renekton-Kennen matchup can be kind of hit or miss, but especially with the magic resist nerfs to Renekton-Kennen is actually a very difficult matchup for Renekton now. Or I should say the magic resist nerfs to Renekton. And then Talia can get out on the map and move around, but not if Maple plays well, and especially if Gen.G is very active. This is a very good draft coming in from PSG, and it gives them a lot of tools. And if they want a wombo in the late game, which is something that obviously they're going to be very comfortable doing, that's the part of the game that they feel good about, then they have the opportunity to. I think this comp really does only get better as the game goes on, and you have a lot of tools to win early, which I would say is the goal of basically any draft. I mean, that's as good as it can get, and so credit to PSG. I will say it did look a little bit shaky at the beginning of the game. There were moments where I just didn't feel nearly as good about what they were offering, about, how they were playing out. But again, early game has not necessarily been their strength, even in the PCS, where they were pretty clearly the best team in the region. They still struggled in the early game at least a little bit. Aji is probably the best laner of everybody on the team. Maple certainly has his positives, but Gen.G is not exactly this fast-paced jungler that likes to set the tempo. Wacko and Woody, I should say. Sorry if I call him Waco. It's just a force of habit at this point that I have to break. Wacko and Woody are fine in lane. They're good. They're just not great. They're just fine. You're really kind of relying on this team scaling into the late game where they all are excellent team fighters. That's definitely the strength, especially Gen.G and Maple, like I talked about in my primer video, and that very much came to fruition here in Game 1. Player of the game is going to go to Maple in the mid lane. I was hyping him up before the tournament, talking about how good he was in the PCS, and even before that, how good he was in the LCS in Spring Split. People tend to forget that Maple was actually really good for TSM at the beginning of this year because he was really bad last year. And people kind of forget that he was in the LCS at the beginning of the year. But no, he probably had his, no, I shouldn't say probably, he easily had his best LCS split in the Spring Split. He leaves to go to PSG Talon. He wants to make Worlds, and I understand that. Goes back to his home region and is able to do so. He's able to clearly be the #1 mid laner coming out of the PCS and really just kind of dominate that region, be incredibly consistent towards the back half of games, and genuinely be one of the scarier mid laners in the play-ins at this stage of the tournament. I really loved how he played Nico. He was very active, moving around the map, and those engages towards the back half of the game, like, they were game-winning engages coming out from Maple, and that's just exactly what you need to see from him. We talked about Gen.G and Maple really being kind of the game changers for PSG, and the reason that I was ranking this team in the C tier and not in the D tier, they're the players with the experience to be able to get them beyond a lot of these teams, and I think at the very least in game #1, Maple definitely came in clutch. Woody was also really good in the support position. This is someone that I was hyping up a ton midway through this year. I watched the PCS at least a little bit while I was doing a lot of the other regions, and, you know, Woody looked fantastic. I didn't love his playoff tape nearly as much as I loved some other supports that were coming in to this tournament, which is why I ranked him just as like a good play-in support, but his upside is significantly higher than that. As I had been saying, especially on social media, small plug, go follow me on Twitter, down in the description, but as I had been saying basically all year up until that point, Woody was really, really solid for PSG, and he continued to look really good in this game. Wacko's very good. I mean, he's not great, he's just solid. He's exactly what you want out of an AD carry. He's not really going to give over a ton of mistakes. He's going to win lanes that he can win, that, you know, you put prio into him, and he's not going to, you know, die in team fights randomly. He's going to be positioned relatively well, and he's going to be able to deal a lot of damage. It's really up to the rest of the team in order to play make. Aji was somebody that obviously everybody had hyped up tremendously going into this series and going into Worlds this year, but I didn't necessarily see it with Aji in the same way that I did with another player like Kiaya, elsewhere in this group, I guess you could say, but Aji was fine in the top lane on Kennen. Like I said, he's probably the best laner this team has, and so everybody really doing their part. Gen.G obviously facilitating it all in the Jarvan. Just a good performance coming in from PSG. I think their draft went a long way, and I think they executed it well. They're great at team fighting, and they showed that off again in this game #1. And then for R7, you know, I'm not going to penalize you too much for this first game of the series. I think that there was some good alongside the bad. The good was that you actually, you know, started to play your own game, and I think that there are a lot of minor region teams, tier 3 region teams, if you will, that come into worlds, come into international tournaments, and try to adapt their game to what is working for some of the better teams in the world at that moment. I think R7 is a team that's not going to do that. They're going to come in and play their style, and I think they did relatively well. Players like Seo actually had a relatively good impact on the early game here. They just couldn't sustain it really at all. A lot of these champions were just a little bit too inactive. Mireyu ended up falling off really hard on the Talia. Not really a champion that's super a part of his wheelhouse, but they banned out the Akali, and I guess he didn't want to go more towards those assassins. Something that he's obviously much more well known for than the shove and roamers. That's not really his style, or at least what he's shown off in the LLA. And then, you know, done of the game for me is going to go to Audi in the jungle. I was praising Audi for what he was doing in the LLA playoffs. I thought he was spectacular. He was someone that I was criticizing quite a bit coming into MSI. A big reason why I didn't have a lot of faith in this team at MSI was because of Audi, but it felt like he was turning it around, like he was playing some of the best League that he has played in many years. It just didn't stick, and this was a rough game number one. The Viego was constantly out of position, taking fights that he absolutely shouldn't. And, you know, we praised PSG's team fighting, but Audi's team fighting on a champion that really does excel in that part of the game was very disappointing, and it simply has to be better. Jungle mid looks like a pretty big gap in favor of PSG after the first game, but again, it's only the first game. This is a best of 3, not a best of 5, so you only need to win 2 games in order to move on to, you know, the next round, the winners finals, if you will, of this side of the bracket. And that means Audi and Mireyu really have to get their shit into gear very, very quickly. You can't really be losing this hard in game number 2 as well, because that's going to give your team a hard chance of winning. Seo is still very good. I still rank him very highly in terms of the AD carries and the plans. Lions is fine. Nautilus is whatever. His engages were fine, just not a lot of follow-up. And Bong lost in lane in a matchup that I wouldn't expect him to actually be able to win. And so, for the most part, R7 just needs to get into a better position. I'd love to see them on blue side and to see them put themselves in a position where they can get some of the power picks in the meta. But for now, you just got to keep your head in there because game 2 is so important. This series could be over after game number 2 if R7 isn't able to take that win. So, is R7 going to keep the series alive, or is PSG going to continue their momentum, show that they are just a little bit more talented, a little bit more clinical towards the back half of the game, and take the series pretty easily 2-0? Well, the winner of game number 2 was PSG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this best of 3 2-0 in a nice little small little sweep here. And they looked really good doing so. I think, again, this was a pretty clear cut, like, this is how they like to play the game, this is what they want to do, example of what you can expect from PSG for most of this tournament. R7 is just one of those teams that needs a lot of momentum in order to execute on some of the strategies that they find most comfortable in, especially with a draft like this. You're kind of hoping and praying that you can scale into the late game and team fight a little bit more efficiently than a team that, you know, has something like a Jace that's going to be moving around early in the mid game, but you're just not going to be able to do that against PSG. They're going to be able to outplay you at that point, and then especially if you're handing over early game, they're going to be able to outplay you there as well. So good stuff from PSG. Player of the game for me in game 2 is going to go to Gen.G in the jungle. It felt like he was probably the one with the most amount of impact. I know a lot of people are going to give this to Maple. Don't worry, I'll talk about him in a second, but Gen.G to me was the most impactful member of PSG in game number 2. It felt like the Maokai ultimates just had absolutely no answer from the side of R7. Like, you have so many tools to be able to fight in the late game here with Maokai ultimate just closing off a lot of objectives. Basically, immediately, you've got Aphelios on the backside. Rumble ultimate is obviously always going to be a big deal to try and deal with, but, you know, this is kind of reminiscent of the 2022 World Championships, if I'm being entirely honest, with how Maokai was utilized. Remember, he was a super highly prioritized pick, the most prioritized jungler in the game last year, for these particular reasons, because if you're not going to be willing to pick something that can actively disable him or try to match it, something like a Sylas, then he's just going to have something you don't, and that's complete zone control in close quarter fights. And if PSG is smart, they're going to be able to play around that. And look at the rest of this comp. They're built for close quarter fights. You can't contest objectives if they get there first with Jace Shockwaves, potential Rumble ultimates hitting 3 or 4 people in a team fight if you're, like, in River. Like, there's just so many opportunities for PSG to be able to dominate fights purely based off of their positioning, and R7 didn't really respect that, and that's why Gen.G, I think, was super effective. Obviously, the continuous dives of mid lane throughout the mid game here were very impactful as well. Mireyu could never stay online as the Orianna. Part of it is his fault for sure, which we will talk about, but Gen.G just outpacing Audi the entire game, outpacing a jungler who, we'll talk about, it was just incredibly slow, and playing really active is a huge positive, and Gen.G is still someone that I rank very highly. And then Maple in the mid lane. He's not going to get player of the game. He is going to get player of the series for me, though. In the 2 games, I guess, that they played, he was the most effective. I think the Jace was really good here in game 3, or game 2, pardon, final game of the series, so I've got my brain wired differently. But I think Maple was really good here. In game number 2, had a lot of different avenues to be able to create his own advantages, I would say. Obviously, this comp relies a ton on Jace to be able to establish that early pressure, and that's really the lane that I think was the biggest problem for R7, was mid lane here, where Maple was just consistently up in tempo, and was able to move around the map, was able to create lanes for Maokai, and a lot of that was because the Sejuani was super slow, but Mireyu on the Orianna also was way too far forward in so many different scenarios trying to actively contest this laning phase. You have to give it over. You have to say, I'm not going to be able to survive this. My R5 Orianna is for late game. It's not for now, but Mireyu, just too aggressive of a player to do that, and Maple and Gen.G absolutely took advantage. They're still the best jungle mid duo, in my opinion, in the play-in stage, and that includes BDS, and I really do think that that's going to continue to propel them, but this team continues to team fight at a high level. You've got the Rumble in the top lane. Don't love the pick here, especially with K'Sante selected. I think K'Sante is actually really good in the Rumble. Maybe I'm crazy, but you know, whatever. It's fine. Aji was fine, and I think Rumble's going to be pretty highly prioritized, and then the Aphelios Rakan's just super solid. Wacko, I should say, and Woody were good. Woody in particular, I think, was really good this series. But Maple and Gen.G were definitely the standout players, and that's honestly what we expected from PSG going into this series, that these two were going to be the ones that dominated, and they came through. And then for R7, they're going to be moving down to the lower bracket now. Of course, not eliminated just yet. They have one more loss in them. It's double elimination, at least at this stage of the tournament, and so they're still alive, but they did not look good in this series at all. A lot of the hyping up that I was doing for R7 just didn't come to fruition. I do think it's a bit of a playstyle mismatch, but I don't understand why you picked red side in game number 2, if I'm being entirely honest. It really felt like blue side was incredibly strong all year long leading up to this point, and for you to lose game 1 and then decide that you want to stay on red side just confuses me, and so it's unfortunate that they did go in that direction, but a couple of these players played really bad this series. Audi is somebody who just did not have a good series. He got dead of the game in game 2 as well as game number 1. He was just so inactive. I know the scoreline doesn't look particularly bad, but a complete like AFK farm style in the jungle for the first 15 minutes of the game, and then by the time we hit the team fight stage, he's whiffing Sejuani ultimates. There was no effect on the game from Audi, and this was something that we were concerned about. He has struggled internationally, basically throughout the entirety of his career, even after being one of the best domestic players in the history of the LLA. He was great in the playoffs this year as well, but it just feels like that curse and that mentality is too hard to break for him, and I don't know if it's mental, I don't know what it is, but it continues to be an issue, and then Mireyu was also a problem in this series. I was more pumping the brakes on Mireyu than I was after MSI. You know, before MSI, I was like, this guy's cracked. He's dominating the LLA. He's one of the best mid laners in a minor region that I've seen. He wasn't as good in the LLA in Summer Splitter, at least in the playoffs. I didn't feel nearly as confident. He's continuing to struggle here at Worlds. This laning phase was bad. He was pushing up. He's an aggressive player. We know that. He likes those assassins. Look at the Akali, the Sylas getting banned out against him, but the Orianna can't be doing that. You can't be doing that if you're going to be picking something as safe as Ori. Seo, I think, played really poorly. He was a player I loved coming into this tournament. I thought he was the best player on R7. You know, Lions, Bong, they're whatever, but they just got outclassed. They're not as good of a team as PSG, and that became abundantly clear. I'm not going to sit here and completely rule them out from being able to take down the loser of GAM or Loud, because I do think that it's possible that they are able to go toe-to-toe against one of those two teams, but it just feels like PSG has proven in this series that they definitely are a tier above, you know, almost every other team in the play-ins, and they deserve to be listed as such. So R7 moving down, PSG moving on to face the winner of the next series, but a very, very good look for a PSG Talon team that I think wants to solidify their spot in the main stage here. But now we move on to our second series of this A bracket here on day number 1, and this is the one I was looking forward to the most on the first day, because I think it's a really interesting clash between two very evenly matched teams. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports and the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Loud. Very excited that we're getting this matchup in round 1, because I don't think that there is a more evenly matched, I guess, matchup between two teams in the first round. I think on either side of the bracket, I really like both of these teams. I think both of them are right below PSG for me for being, you know, teams that absolutely could get out of the play-ins and get into the main stage if everything goes well. Both of them have been very highly rated by me. Now, They've done it for basically different reasons, although they're both very aggressive teams. I think they're aggressive in different ways. GAM is much more about just kind of outpacing and outclassing a lot of the opponents that they've come up against. A lot of their players are spectacular laners and have very consistently been able to output a ridiculous amount of damage over the course of a lot of games, specifically Kiaya in the top lane, who I do think is the best top laner in the play-in stage, with the exception of maybe Adam, who's also very good, but Kiaya is phenomenal. I think that he is arguably a top 3 player in a minor region right now. Of the PCS, VCS, any of the minor regions, I think Kiaya is up there for one of the most interesting players, and you know, I think it's going to be really interesting to see if he can perform like that at Worlds. We've hyped up top laners internationally that have dominated domestically before, and they don't always perform in the way that you might want them to. It's just a very I guess, difficult role to really have an impact in if the rest of your team is losing super hard, but I like Kiaya a lot as a player. We've seen what can happen when he does get to play strong side, when he does get to play, you know, in that position very far forward, and I think that we're just kind of hoping and praying that we can get that. I think Levy and Kati are also more than solid as starters here for GAM and are definitely players that are going to push the team forward at the play-in stage, but Slater and Pallet are definitely a question mark. Slater actually was really good in the VCS, but he had a lot of traits that led me to believe that he could struggle internationally, which is exactly what I said in the primer. I'm not a fan of Pallet. I think he's probably the weakest support at this tournament, and we'll see if that ends up panning out. I know that there are a lot of other, you know, analysts that have ranked him higher than me. I have not seen it. I think that he, like I said, I ranked him at number 23 in terms of my supports. We'll see if that pays off. But Slater is one of those players that really likes to skill check his opponents. We'll see if he can get away with that against better teams. And then for Loud, even more aggressive somehow than what GAM is. I know we talk about Levy and Kiaya and Slater really pushing the tempo for GAM, but Loud does that everywhere on the map at all points in time. There are 5 players on this team that work really well together, and I think that's really what unlocks them. Seos is kind of their leader, if you will, or at least that's how I've identified it. I love Seos. I think that he is a superstar waiting to be picked up by a major region here in Brazil, whether you want to agree with that or not. I think players like Robo and Tinones have a lot of potential as well. Tinones in particular just continues to be an incredibly stable mid laner. He's more of that, you know, support style mid laner. He's not going to play a ton of these like hyper carries like the Tristana or the Jace. I say hyper carries, but you know, heavy resource carries in the mid lane. He's going to be somebody that moves around the map and wants to help his team a bit more, but that just enables Loud to play even more aggressive. Croc has played really well domestically. Root, I think, is an interesting player. I think he's solid mechanically. He's not a star, but I think he's, you know, propped up a lot by the fact that he gets to lane with Seos, and he's very consistent in the late game. And so, in general, Loud is also a very complete team. I would argue that GAM is more talented, but again, I think their playstyle is more feast or famine. The aggression that Loud shows, I think, is very sustainable. And so, I do think both teams have a pretty good shot to win this. Like I said in my video yesterday in the World's Qualifying Series, where I kind of predicted who would get out of here, I really kind of left this up to be a 50-50. I predicted GAM because I do think they're more talented, but again, you know, if these players don't show up, they don't show up, and that's a very real possibility. But we got to start with game number 1, so who's going to be able to take the first game of the series and establish some tempo? Well, the winner of game number 1 was Loud. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. Congratulations to Loud. This is a huge win for this team, and honestly, they looked good. They looked good throughout the entirety of this game. This was a dominant win from a team that, you know, I had high expectations for, and I know a lot of other analysts had high expectations for. I'm certainly not the only one online that is, you know, heaping the praises of what Loud was able to do in the CB LOL, but they've been really, really fun to watch over the past year, and they've continued that here in game number 1. Being able to establish leads, being able to establish tempo, even in a game where, honestly, I don't really love their draft. I actually think they got out-drafted. I think that GAM, for the most part, has more options here. It just doesn't really matter. When you have Viego, plus Kaisa in particular, and even a really good Rakan, it doesn't really matter that I think GAM has more options in the early to mid game. If you do hit those power spikes, especially if you win early, this game is just over very, very quickly, and that's exactly what happened for Loud. Player of the game for me, easily, no-brainer. Gonna go to Root in the bot lane. How do you give it to anybody else? Our first pentakill of the World Championships. He gets it right as the game is ending on Kaisa, and I don't get why people have kind of gone out on Kaisa. If anything, I truly do believe that she is stronger now than she has been for a lot of this year, and she was consensus number 180 carry in the entire game for most of this year. So to see so many teams start to move away from her, I think that's a trend that we're not exactly going to see carry over into the main stage. I think good teams are going to continuously bring out Kaisa with how strong she is, and You know, Root definitely showing that off here, just kind of dominating. Once you get the ball rolling on that champion, it never really stops. Root's, you know, a player that I wasn't going to say concerned about for Loud, because I didn't think he was bad. I just didn't think he was exceptional. So to see him have a really good game in game number 1 here of Worlds is phenomenal for him. If he can build that confidence, we know Seos is going to be great. We know Tinones is going to do a really good job of enabling him. Croc in that same vein. You know, Robo's a very good top laner as well. If you can get Root on board, this becomes an even scarier team than I think I even predicted in my primer, and he certainly was on board in game number 1. Seos was obviously phenomenal on Rakan. He's going to go pretty undervalued for how good he was in this game. There was a pretty massive support gap in this game. Palette was miserable and Seos was awesome, and this is exactly what I predicted in the primer. I hope that this is one of those takes that ends up working out for me, that Seos is, you know, maybe even the best support in the play-in stage. I think I have him ranked as the best support in the play-in stage. He certainly looked like it in game number 1 on the Rakan. Tinones looked good on the Nico. Kind of a pick that really fits into his style of wanting to move around the map, wanting to play a more team-oriented style. It's why Tinones has been so good for so long, because he just allows a ton of different play styles. Croc and Robo were solid, certainly not going to complain about what they offered. Robo survived the matchup into Rumble, which is significantly harder now, and I think Croc did a good job of neutralizing a lot of what Jarvan wanted to do in the early game, and so Loud just looking really solid. They were able to control the objectives, they were able to get their carry online, and they knew the win condition. If they got Kai'Sa there, then they could win the game, and that's exactly what they did. And then for GAM on the other side, I mean, they didn't play very well in game number 1, and this was the concern with this team is we know how talented they are, and we know how good they looked when they were beating up on worse teams, but their playstyle did have some flaws in it, which is why I was concerned and why I didn't put them in my C tier. Even though talent-wise they deserve to be in that C tier, it's because I really don't know if the playstyle carries over, and it's certainly no fears being assuaged in game number 1, because this was bad. This was bad from everybody on the team, but specifically the bot lane, who got completely outplayed. Both Slater and Palette were miserable in this game. Whether you want to give Dud of the game to Slater or Palette is up to you. I think both of them deserve it. I'm going to give it to Slater because it felt like he was more actively making bad plays for the team, but Palette was also egregiously bad, missing hooks and just generally not putting his team in a good position. But Slater, this is kind of the concern with him. I hyped him up at least a little bit in the primer because I'm like, he's super talented. His mechanics are actually pretty insane, and his laning stats were impressive, I should say, for the VCS. He knows how to get a lead and he knows what to do with a lead, but his aggressive style when you watch him on tape, when you watch the games, very much shows a player that can be taken advantage of, and that's exactly what happened in this first game. The Xayah should be winning this bot lane matchup pretty consistently. Maybe the Rakan, like, equals this out a little bit, because I do think Rakan is pretty difficult to play into early right now, but Slater still should not be losing nearly as hard as he did, and a lot of that was just really bad positioning and bad map awareness coming in from him. Palette obviously didn't help. The Nautilus was bad this game, but the bot lane has to be better, because this was a disaster for them, and they were the weak point for me going into Worlds anyways. But it's not like the strong points were doing well. Orianna continues to disappoint, and this is something that I'm going to continue to monitor. I have a lot of people telling me that Orianna is this sleeper great pick, and I wasn't super sold going into Worlds. I was like, at best, it's probably a tier 2. I accidentally left her off my meta report video. That was probably a mistake. She's definitely at least a tier 2 pick, but R1, Orianna, blind, like, it's too slow. Like, it's going to be taken advantage of. A lot of these teams that got to Worlds got there based off of playing really fast and playing through their mid lane, like shoving and roaming, playing, you know, these 3v3 skirmishes, especially around 10 minutes, and Ori's just not super good at that, or at least isn't as good as what they've been playing in recent years, and so something to monitor, but Ori continues to kind of disappoint in some of the games that she's been played in by some of the worst teams. The Jarvan was just kind of irrelevant. Great job by Croc to shut down Levy and really not allow him to take over in the early game, and Kiaya was not very good on the Rumble either, even in a good matchup, and so GAM not looking great in game 1. Obviously, they still have the talent to bounce back from this, but you know, early signs point to concern for GAM. If Loud can take this game number 2 and close out this series really quickly with a 2-0 win, that's going to prove really, really positive for them. That's going to give them a ton of momentum, but GAM is not a team you can count out. 1 win's great, but you got to get 2. So are they going to be able to get 2, or is GAM going to be able to keep it alive? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Loud. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series in a very quick 2-0 sweep, and GAM, you didn't show up here today. A couple of these players really underperforming, but I think more of a story really is just how good Loud actually is. This is not a false set, win here. This is not GAM super underperforming and Loud not really that good of a team. This is all of the strengths that Loud showed domestically coming out on the international stage, and that's maybe the most exciting thing that you could possibly say if you are a fan of the CB LOL and if you are cheering for Loud at this tournament. A lot of these players have had really good moments and have really shown that they have the ability to be strong, but it's gotta show up on the international stage. It's gotta be consistent, and it was at the very least here in this first series. Let's go ahead and talk about game number 2. Player of the game for me is going to go to Robo in the top lane. Talk about a player that has finally started to show up. He was actually very quietly awesome at Worlds last year. I know people tend to forget about Worlds last year. I don't really know why. The play-in stage was really fun. DRX being in there, Fnatic going on that big run, Mad Lions, Evil Geniuses, Saigon Buffalo. There were a ton of really fun teams last year that were kind of duking it out, but Loud was definitely one of them. They took a game off of Fnatic. People tend to forget that. They looked really good, and Robo was probably the biggest reason for that. He dominated at Worlds in the play-in stage last year. I was crazy high on him going into MSI, and things just didn't work out at that tournament. Loud did well, and honestly, I think they were still a relatively decent team, but Robo in particular, I think didn't necessarily hold up his end of the bargain in some of those series, but he goes back to the CB LOL, and he continues to be really strong. I don't know if I was just a little bit lower on him or something. I just didn't feel quite as good about him. I think his tape was a little bit less strong side, and it wasn't as flashy to me, and maybe I just started to get a little bit blinded by that, but I don't know. Robo's still that player. Robo's still that dude. All of that to say, Robo's that dude, and he came out in this game, and he absolutely showed that he is still that dude. The Cassante was brutal. I know that champion is still incredibly strong. For my money, he's still the best top laner in the game. He has been all year long. I know people love Renekton, but I think Cassante is still in a very, very good spot, and Robo really showed that off. He was basically a better Lee Sin this game than Levy was on the other side of the map, able to reposition everybody as he saw fit and just deal a ridiculous amount of damage while being the tankiest member in the entire game. Cassante is incredibly broken, and Robo really took advantage of that. But player of the series for me as a whole is going to go to Root in the bot lane. He got the pentakill in game number 1. He still was incredibly solid on the Xayah here in game number 2. I like this draft a lot from Loud. I think it gives you options. I think if you are going to pick something like Orianna in, comparison to maybe some of the other more aggressive options in the mid lane right now, something like Nocturne actually does rise in viability. Nocturne was a pick that I actually kind of hated on for most of this year because it was consistently getting paired up with things like the Nico, and it just didn't feel like it was working in the way that it needed to. You weren't getting a lot of wins out of it. You were kind of just diving into the backline, trying to set up this wombo combo and just trading 1-for-1 inevitably, but I think with Orianna, you actually get a little bit more out of it. You can actually enable the Nocturne to be a little bit more of a carry in a comp like this. Same thing with the Xayah, and so really like how this ended up playing out for Loud. I thought Tinones was really good on Ori, one of the better Ori performances we've seen at the tournament so far, and then, like I said, Root continues to be very consistent. I think Seos is awesome. There's just not much else I can say about him that I haven't already said. I've kind of really sold him, I hope, to you guys about how good I think he is, how much I think he impacts what Loud likes to do as a team, but Seos was phenomenal in the series. Croc was certainly the better jungler. It's always fun to see Nocturne played against Levy, who's like the Nocturne god from back in the day, and so really, really fun to see that, but everybody on Loud really held up their end of the bargain. Root, I should say, is going to get my player of the series, but Robo was great. Seos was great. Tinones and Croc were really good too. Just a team performance from Loud and a great win. And then for GAM on the other side, this bot lane was just miserable. There really is no other way to put it. They consistently underperformed, and this was my concern with GAM going into the tournament. I think I said these exact words in my primer, but yeah, I said if GAM was going to underperform, it was going to be because of the bot lane, because Slater's over-aggressiveness and over-eagerness to try to make plays early gets him into trouble, and Pallet just not being very good, in my opinion, and that has come to fruition. Now, that's not to say it's the only problem. I think Kati really did not perform at all in this series, somebody who I did actually rate pretty highly, and then Levy and Kiaya were fine in this game. I think the Renekton and the Lee Sin were generically fine. Renekton in particular, I think, actually had a pretty good game. I think Kiaya did some interesting things and tried to salvage in the mid game, but only so much you can do when the bot lane plays like this. Slater's gonna get another dud of the game. His positioning is, like, atrociously bad. Like, I know he got away with a lot in the VCS. I talked about it in the primer. He gets away with more than most AD carries, but he's crazy mechanically talented. I thought he was going to be able to clean that stuff up. He certainly hasn't before Worlds. The mistakes are only compounded by the fact that Loud is very aggressive and willing to try to capitalize on those issues. He was basically walking directly in front of melee carries like Cassante and just dying, and just very, very strange plays coming in from a late-game hyper carry like the Kai'Sa. To play like that in the mid-game is just not very good. I know the scoreline looks okay, but the actual game did not reflect that. Slater was not good in this series, and Pallet continues to basically be nothing on the rel. They got completely outplayed in lane, which is expected in this 2v2 to not have pressure, but for Pallet to be so useless in a lot of these engages on a champion that I think me and a lot of other people think is very broken right now in rel is just not, it's not a good look. Kati went damageless Ahri, which, again, I'm pro if you have a strong Kai'Sa and if you have a strong Lee Sin, but you didn't this game, and so maybe you needed to go something else. You know, Kiaya was fine, but Levy was invisible, even with a good scoreline. Just not a good game and not a good series from GAM. The concerns and the worries that we had pre-tournament are definitely still there, and they're definitely coming out right now. They're going to go down into lower bracket to take on R7, which is obviously a favorable matchup for them, or you would believe it's a favorable matchup for them, but R7's not a pushover. If GAM continues to play like this, especially if the bot lane continues to play like this, I like Seo, not Seos, Seo. It's hard to get those two, you know, mixed back and forth, but I like Seo for R7, and I think he could take advantage of a weak bot lane if GAM is not ready, and so we definitely need to see a better version of them if they want to stay in this tournament. And then for Loud, they move on now to face PSG. Now that's a matchup I'm incredibly excited for. Talk about contrasting styles. It's aggression versus team fighting, and I'm very excited to see how that goes. But for Loud to dominate and go 2-0 in their first series at Worlds this year, it just goes to show that a lot of the faith and a lot of the hype in the CB LoL right now is definitely well-founded. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2023 play-ins Day 1 overview and analysis video. Both of this series are done. Up on the screen is the updated bracket. We now have Loud and PSG in kind of the A-side winners finals. Of course, even winning this doesn't qualify you for the main stage. What ends up happening is if you win this, you get out of the A-side as the number 1 seed, and then you will face the number 2 seed from the other side. If you lose that game, you go down into that losers finals for the chance to be that number 2 seed, but so far, no one is eliminated. Everyone still has the potential to get out of this play-in stage, if you will, even GAM or R7, who would be able to get out as a number 2 seed in their group. But very, very interesting matchups. I'm quickly going to preview the right side of the bracket, your B side of the bracket, if you will, because that's what's happening tomorrow. Of course, I will still cover the other games when we do eventually get to them, but for now, let's cover B side, BDS versus Team Wales. We're going to cover very quickly because this should not be close. BDS is infinitely better than Team Wales. I think Wales is the worst team at this tournament, and I think BDS is genuinely very good. They've consistently been able to overperform expectations, and it does feel like they've gotten some of their spring form back in destroying Golden Guardians. If that confidence is there, if Adam and Crownie can play like they did in the spring split, then this should not be close. This should be a very quick 2-0 for BDS. And then DFM versus CFO. This is a more interesting matchup because I just don't particularly like either of these teams, but CFO should be the better of these two teams. The Oysters are pretty talented. They just haven't really been able to bring out that talent over the course of this year. There are a couple of players there that I think are, at the very least, respectable, and, you know, I don't think DFM's very good. Apparently, Oppaman is officially starting in the top lane, and Udapon is going back into the bot lane. I do think that's probably the better decision. Milan was just not very good for this team in the bot lane, but I don't know if it's going to be enough. I really don't grade DFM very highly. I think they're right there with Team Wales as the bottom 2 teams at Worlds this year, and CFO should be able to get that job done. Maybe it goes to 3, but they really should be able to get it done in 2, if we're being honest. But those are my thoughts. Those are my opinions. That's my coverage. If you enjoyed the video, like I said at the beginning, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and of course, it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We are going to post about Worlds every single day on this channel. If you want daily coverage of everything going on, all the games, all the players, from somebody who's watched all 4 of the major regions and all of the playoffs in the minor regions, then this is the place for it. Hit subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.